Hi, hello everybody. Welcome to the last recorded session of the 2021 Travel Unity virtual sessions of our summit. I wanted to say one more time, next week we will be in Lake Placid for our in-person sessions. I want to thank our hosts up there, Roost. Oop. I want to say thank you to MMGY Global, who is one of our silver sponsors this year, and thank them very much for the work that they did with us to collaborate on the Vistas Latinas study, which is available through their website. You could purchase that, and all of the proceeds go to Travel Unity and our programming. I would also like to thank Thailand. Thank you, Thailand. I'd also like to thank Cayuga County. Thank you, Cayuga County. I'd also like to thank Rochester and Visit Fort Collins, Colorado at Legoland New York Resort and North America Tour Hub, and CITA and CITA Youth Foundation for supporting our youth summit up in Lake Placid next week. Thank you to all of our partners. We love very, very deeply. And now let's start things off. So why are we doing this session? What does travel have to do with sports? Well, if you had asked me a couple years ago, I would have said, well, every time I look at a destination marketing organization, they seem to have some sports person. I never end up talking to those people, but they seem to be there. So there seems to be something to do with sports. Clearly, people travel in sports. Events to me is a bit more obvious. But overall, I say this quite seriously. Sports was not part of my trajectory and thought process within the about a decade or so that I've been in the travel industry. It really was only last year that I started having a greater understanding of that connection and started seeing why we should, as the travel industry, be doing more to bridge this. So that's one aspect of it. The other thing is, and our panel will be talking about this in a little bit, consistently when I spoke to folks about events in general, when we talked to them about how we were going to start making DEI standards for travel and tourism, they said, well, are you doing anything in the event space? Because the event space is not very diverse. So events, sports, it was a part of our thinking, but our focus for a good year or so was really around visitor-facing organizations. Now we're expanding that. So we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but the point of this session really is when you've got something happening, an event, a sporting event that comes and it goes, what are the considerations around DEI that are similar or different to the idea of a destination that's going to be there all the time, hotel that's going to be there presumably for a long time, and that's what we're going to dig into. So before I hand it over, I just want to say one more thing, which is we consider ourselves at Travel Unity as a part of the sustainability. Sustainability as a part of the travel industry has predated our work. We founded in 2016, and sustainability has been around a lot longer than that. And the thing about sustainability is a lot of times people pigeonhole it as really just being about environment. And this group of folks is really going to dig into the idea of triple bottom line. That sustainability, true sustainability, is not just, yes, it does include natural world, but it's also about people and profits as well. So with that, I would like to introduce my friend, Kelly. Can I call you that yet? All right.
Of course you can, Roni.
All right.
So thank you so much for that great introduction, Roni. And I think that was a perfect framing for today's conversation. So thank you all first for joining us today. It's a pleasure, especially on a Friday afternoon right before Halloween. So I know everyone's probably heading out in their costumes shortly after this, but a few things about me first, and then I'll give some framing to what I'm going to be discussing today in the conversation. So my name is Kelly Cerialo. I'm a professor at Paul Smith College in New York in the Business and Hospitality Department. I'm also the co-chair for the UNESCO Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Network. And I'm on the committee for the US National UNESCO Biosphere Network. So my research focuses primarily on what Roni was just discussing about looking at the social impacts of tourism and also of events. So kind of the temporary aspect of the social impacts on a community. So before I begin today, I do want to say a few more thank yous. So not only to Roni, but to Zoe, Nick, and Chi, who you're going to be hearing from shortly. They've been an incredible team to work on this panel with, so I'm honored to be part of this incredible lineup. So, and again, this conversation about DEI in sports and events is a critical piece to what's happening in the larger conversation around DEI. So to start the conversation today, I just wanted to address some of the challenges related to the triple bottom line that Roni just mentioned. So what's been interesting to watch is over the last 15 years, there's been increasing pressures on sports and events to start to pay attention, as Roni said, to sustainability and looking at the triple bottom line. But what's interesting is because investors and sponsors often find environmental issues a bit more sexy because it helps their corporate social responsibility image. They tend to lean heavier on the environmental side of it. The other flip side of the environmental side is that it's easier to quantify, right? So it's easier when you're measuring carbon emissions, when you're measuring waste, when you're measuring air quality, water quality. So our tendency, and I say our, when you're talking about sports and event managers, it's our tendency is to kind of lean heavily on that environmental piece, which is great. I think we absolutely need to be doing that. But as the panelists are going to share with you today, there is an interconnectedness and an interdependence between the three stools of sustainability. So when you're talking about environmental issues, I strongly argue that you can't separate them. You can't just talk about environmental issues because they inherently have social justice issues tied to them. And in with that, which Nick is going to be talking about shortly, is there's also deep economic issues that, and most of the time inequities, that are related to the impacts of tourism and events and sports. So again, we're going to be diving deeper into that, but I just wanted to emphasize and frame the discussion of how interconnected these three pieces of the triple bottom line are. And I strongly believe that they cannot be measured in a vacuum. They need to be considered together. And when you're thinking about that together, they need to be planned for together and then also measured and analyzed after. So with that, I do want to turn it over to Nick. Nick is going to dive more into specifically the economic side of these impacts. And then I'll come back to you later to talk more about the social impacts with Zoe. So thank you again so much for joining us. And we're looking forward to the rest of the conversation with you. Nick, it's all yours.
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate it. First, I want to thank everybody for joining this conversation. I also want to thank Roni and Chi and Kelly and Zoe for just putting this together and being some wonderful people to work with, especially as we tackle DEI in sport and events, especially in tourism. And so, like Kelly mentioned, I'm going to focus on the profit, the economic impact side of things when hosting sporting events. And I like to look at this from a couple different angles. So first of all, economic impact, that's the sexy number that everybody likes to post when major sporting events are being hosted, the type of impact, the type of money that's being spent at these sporting events, and in many cases is a very large number. But even in smaller communities, smaller events, they have just as big an impact. And so you also want to gauge what an event is worth and how an event can impact your community. The thing that's tricky about economic impact is that the DMO, the organizations, they don't have necessarily the say as where that money is truly being spent because they're earning their revenue via the hotel motel tax, bed tax, and tax, and the money that's being generated is purely taxes. And so government officials obviously get to decide where that money goes. But I think it's really important to understand how money is being spent when an event is going on. And I think we've started seeing it a little bit in terms of promoting minority-owned businesses and making it a little bit more accessible to understand and know who within that community is available and what those resources are and what they have to offer. And that's truly where a DMO can make a difference in terms of how money is being spent. Because at the end of the day, the bottom line is to generate dollars within the community to improve economic development within that specific community, but then being able to take a more targeted approach in terms of how do you push those participants to different areas within your community and to promote those minority-owned businesses, I think is that next step to where you can truly make an impact. The other side is how do you determine what the worth of an event is? Because in many cases, communities across the United States, and I'm sure across the globe, use grant-funded programs to fund sporting events, to host sporting events. And so that was a piece that I had worked on in the past where you really take what the bottom line is, and that's the economic impact generated. That's the hotel room nights being sold, the number of people staying and showing up to the event. You take all these different categories and you kind of weight them out. And from there, you're able to really kind of pinpoint where your money is being spent, how it's being spent, and is it proportional to the overall cause and the overall bottom line in terms of generating the most bang for your buck, essentially. And so those are kind of the two areas of focus that I have. And I'm excited to share more thoughts as we carry on this conversation. And I will now turn it over to Zoe.
Yeah, I want to echo all those thank yous. And I actually want to send virtual hugs to everybody. You know, as I sit here in Marietta, Georgia, my son just walked in, but, you know, not interacting in the public sphere as much. I appreciate all of you and all the many conversations that we've had. And then working with Travel Unity and learning about Travel Unity. And I was so excited after our last conversation that I just began to write because we talked about so many good things. Even Kelly, as you opened up, and Nick, as you spoke right now, it's just triggering all these thoughts, you know, in my mind. And so Zoe Moore, real name is Sharita. I go by Zoe. It means zone of energy. I used to do spoken word back in the day. I'm an Army veteran, and I'm currently the co-chair for MPI, which stands for Meeting Professionals International. It's an organization for event professionals, vendors, suppliers. I believe in trade associations or associations that, you know, gather people together. I have my own company. It's More Consulting Agency, and I do business as Grow with Zomo as a way to encourage and empower professionals to really have this conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lot of times you'll see me, you'll hear me say equity, diversity, inclusion, because I want to put the focus on equity. Oftentimes, a lot of companies will pursue diversity and achieve this vanity metrics, right? That person from a marginalized group will be in a position of leadership, possibly, but they won't be given the resources or the support that they need. And so, you know, really pushing the hospitality industry. And when I say hospitality industry, I mean all of these different leisure, recreational, sports activities that bring people together about engagement. I'm really, really interested in both organizational leadership and human behavior. What does it look like to bring people together, understand their culture, their history, their language, music, every aspect of the whole person, right? And as an event professional, because that's where I got my start before I found myself as an advocate or a consultant in DEI, I was an event planner in Oakland. And if you've never been to Oakland, Oakland has this magical way of just educating you, like socially and the people that are there, the history that's there. It really opened up my eyes to how to be this bridge between the activities that were going on in Oakland and what was happening in the corporate space, right? And so as I was a student, you know, pursuing my master's in hospitality, recreation, and tourism, I was active in MPI and just really, you know, wanting to expose individuals, specifically small, underrepresented, under-resourced businesses to the more corporate structure or how they could benefit each other. And so when I engage in this conversation from that people perspective, you know, that third part of the triple bottom line that often gets lost when people are speaking numbers and when they're speaking environment, I actually get shocked. You know, I've been invited to speak on different sessions and people are like, you know, we get the environment, we get the profit side, but we just haven't figured out the people thing. And I'm like, are you a human being? Are you a person? Do you spend money? Do you eat? Do you like to hang out with friends? Do you like to go to sporting? Yes, 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 they say. And I'm like, all those things matter. And in all of those spaces, you know what matters is representation. People want to see themselves in everything that they do. You know, on one of our pre-calls, I mentioned to Nick that I'm no longer a fan of just these isolated silo months. Like I love that we celebrate, you know, Black History Month, and I love that we celebrate, you know, Native American, Indigenous, First Nations Month. I love that we do that as a way to highlight, just like any Christmas or Halloween. But when we get stuck on just, you know, highlighting, amplifying the voices of those communities only during that month and not realizing that 366, I'm adding an extra day intentionally, 366 days of the year, we are who we are, you know, in our different identities, you know, and the intersection of that. So when I go, you know, to a baseball game or a football game, I want to see myself there also. I want to know the history of baseball players. When I go to a basketball game, when I take my son to a hockey game, he at first may not be interested in hockey until he sees, you know, that star hockey player look like him, be from the same neighborhood as him, you know, and you understand the history of hockey. So representation matters. People matter in all aspects of events, sports, and everything that we do. So I'm really excited to have this conversation because it also on the free call, you know, we got really excited. Nick was like, well, I don't know if I'm, you know, off to a right start. And Kelly and I were like, you are on it. 29, 28, however old you are, if you're 18 in this space and you're starting to have this conversation, this dialogue is so important. And I'm excited. And again, thanking Roni and Chi for, you know, trusting me to be in this space and have these conversations because they need to happen.
So the question we have, and attendees, feel free to chime in, audio, video, or in chat. But I want to ask our panelists for sure, what do you think is the top DEI challenge in the events and sports sectors? So I would like each of you, because we did this one together, and I don't know your answers yet. So I'm actually very curious. If you have to pick one of these, Nick, Chi also, you're part of it. We see you. Nick, Chi, and Kelly. Is it A, supplier diversity, B, being inclusive of every attendee? The cat doesn't get a vote, Nick. C, engaging the community. D, unless we need to include the cat, we can be inclusive of cats too. Or D, lack of interest in DEI. So supplier diversity, being inclusive of every attendee, engaging the community, or lack of interest in DEI. Nick Kopka, you're up to bat. Which one is it and why?
Thanks, Roni. Sorry for the random cat jumping in, but I really think it's, and they're all so good, but man, I gotta say, be inclusive of every attendee, because really you kind of see it at sporting events and any event for that matter. You see a lot of ancillary pieces, and I think that's where it's really important to drive home like what that means, like what it means to be inclusive to every attendee, and to really think beyond some of those basic like ADA is a great example where it's like, hey, we want to be ADA compliant and this, that, and like where you have to think about it from more of like I want to make sure that we don't get shut down or something of that nature. And thinking beyond that and trying to think outside the box and being willing to ask the questions of how can we engage with everybody and what does that mean and how does that happen? I think is and you don't really know until you're willing to ask the questions. I mean, I've seen it with a variety of events where you don't really, you come up with ideas and you do things to try and promote, hey, we're being inclusive because we have this musical artist or because we did this thing. But that's not enough if you're not willing to actually engage with the community that you're trying to reach. They're not going to come to an event just because their favorite artist is there. And some will, and that's fine. But unless you're willing to kind of be out there within the community, it's just not genuine. And I think that's where the challenge lies for me personally.
So I'm seeing nodding. Does this make you a vote for B, or do you have another vote?
No, unfair, because Nick kind of went between B and C, and I'm like, I want to
Yeah, I
say,
was gonna call him on it, and I'm like, I'm not gonna do it. I'm not
but
gonna
you
do
know
it.
what? I called
know,
him in a good way, because I want to say A, B, C, D. Is that an answer? You know, because it's again, going back to Kelly saying that interconnected, I can't even say the word, interconnectedness, right? Like they're all so, if you don't engage the community, then you don't get businesses, so there can be supplier diversity. And then if you don't speak about the history of these different sports, you have a lack of interest in DEI. But if by Roni's rules that I have to pick one, I'm gonna go, because I think supplier diversity does a good way of touching on all of those, right? When I go back to how I even got into this, my first study or research was Super Bowl 50, and it was happening in San Francisco. And they were clearing the streets of all what I like to call the neighbors without walls. Other folks call them homeless folks. But neighbors without, they cleared everyone from the streets. Like they were just throwing tents to the left and to the right. There was supposed to be this supplier diversity program where they got, under-resourced, underrepresented businesses in. That program didn't do too well because there was a lack of interest, right? But I think when people see businesses, who are providing different services and products, then they engage. And they're like almost shocked when they see, a woman-owned business or an Asian-owned business or a transgender person walking around and showing you how, when they see different people being people or just peopling, then it's like, it kind of, rewires your biases where you're like, oh, that I didn't think of that person as being able to sell that product or service. Now I'm seeing them. This food is delicious. This service is great. And I want to see more of it. Or it allows you to be exposed to, different people being suppliers. And it's just not one phenotype, not one identity. So supplier diversity, I'm going to go with that one. A for 1,000.
I appreciate that. So you chose something and you went with it. All right, Chi. You're not doing what I do for dessert. It can't be all of them, please.
So I was gonna say this is like choosing my favorite ice cream, but I've had a little time.
You
to
love
think
ice
about
cream. It's funny. I know I'm
I
interrupting, but like this is now the second time I've heard an ice cream anecdote from you. So now I know you really do like ice cream. So
I was gonna say favorite child, but ice cream seems, I don't know. This is kind of a cheat, but I was gonna say lack of interest in DEI. And I say that because I think that the lack of interest comes from a lack of awareness. And, like if you've ever talked to somebody who is very passionate about something that you've never really thought about, and you talk to them and they kind of spread um, that excitement. And I think that that's kind of what we're missing, is this awareness and an understanding of like what DEI can mean. What does diversity mean to you? And I think people are maybe a little bit intimidated by it, and that it doesn't, it's not a term that has it's a very dynamic term with different interpretations. And I think that that's okay. And I think that if we can address the awareness, that we can bring up the interest. And I think that in doing so, we can improve supplier diversity, be more inclusive of attendees, engage the community in a better, more more engaging way. But so my answer is D, lack of interest in DEI.
Right, and it just goes to show, we've got very smart people who have differences of opinion. This is inherently diversity in and of itself. Kelly, are you on somebody's team, or are you
Well,
going to be the C person?
this was actually perfect. Like the flow of this went perfectly. So Chi actually I was going rogue. I was going to add an E to it. So that I was, and Chi actually just said the E that I was going to add. So it was good. So mine was building off the D part, the lack of interest in DEI, but I was going to say lack of knowledge and understanding. And so to Chi's point, I think that the lack of interest does come from that intimidation factor. I think some people hear it, they know that, okay, I should be checking this box, I should be thinking about this. But in terms of the understanding of what that looks like in terms of implementation, of all the things you have on here, how to implement supplier diversity, how to be more inclusive, so how to engage the community. So again, they're aware of it, but I think the lack of knowledge and understanding of how to actually take it from on paper, let's do this, to action is the biggest challenge. So I think that's a really incredible opportunity for us during this conversation today, is to help them think about how to move to that point. So not just saying okay, check these boxes off, but are there specific resources? Zoe had mentioned several, if it's Black-owned businesses or female-owned businesses or trans-owned businesses, just being aware of the options that are out there. And it could be community specific, it could be state specific, or however you want to frame it. But I think helping the organizations feel less intimidated, right? So, and understanding how to start taking small steps. Listen, that's the one thing working in this space I've recognized. It's overwhelming, right? So the idea that when you're thinking about all of these issues at once, those 3 legs, that alone can take one leg can take a lifetime. And you're asking people to work on 3 different parts of the triple bottom line, that's a lot. So in terms of focusing on DEI, helping them take those small steps into integrating that into action. So again, whether it's starting out identifying one supplier, and then the next year they go to another, way to engage the community. And then the next year they're thinking about being more inclusive of the attendees. So I think it's helping them get away from that kind of deer in headlights, oh my God, I know I should be doing this, but I'm not sure how, to an actionable place. So I think that would be my answer. So rogue with E, lack of knowledge and understanding, but helping them kind of get off that, into an action space and less just on paper. Is that okay?
It's okay. I'm going to take it as that we should have reframed D to a lack of interest or knowledge or something like that. So for my purposes, I think you're on Chi's team. So based on the voting, I think Chi and Kelly win this completely arbitrary competition that I've set up for no particular reason other than sport.
But I do have to say, what you just, Roni, I want to say though, it reminds me of, again, it's back to that interconnectedness. So it's we couldn't, all of those things kind of fall under one. So I just wanted to emphasize
everybody wins. Everybody wins. Anyway,
it's a trick question.
I mean, it's a means of conversation. So on to the next topic, which is going deeper into these challenges. So Kelly, you started your part off by saying that part of the reason you think that people like the environmental part is because it's measurable. So if you want to talk more about some of the questions around measuring impact in general.
Yeah, so thanks, Roni. So I think the first thing in terms of framing it, it's helpful to understand the abundance of ways there are to currently measure it. So it's not that we don't have resources we almost have too many. And so that's part of the primary challenge, is that there are so many different resources out there. You name it, there's a tool for it. And it's wonderful, don't get me wrong, they're extremely valuable, but the challenge is because sports and events managers now have so many tools and options, there's not a standardized set. I think half of our time as sports and events managers is trying to figure out, do I have the right one? Is it comprehensive? Am I missing something? And so I'd say that's the first aspect of thinking about the challenges with measurements. I think the other aspect, and this is something that I mentioned early on, so most of my research focuses around the social impacts. And as Roni just mentioned, the social impacts tend to be intangible in nature. They're messy, they're sloppy, they can't be quantifiable. Think of xenophobia. How are you going to measure that, like, and quantify xenophobia, right? So when you're thinking of developing like research methods for that, that takes a lot of time. When you're quantifying acculturation, like, how do you do that? You don't. That's qualitative studies. And so qualitative studies take a lot of time. And I'm sorry, but DMOs and sports and event managers don't have a lot of time and resources to do a long, extensive, comprehensive qualitative study that takes a deep dive into some of these heavy issues around DEI. So I think that is part of the problem, the messiness, right? So the sloppiness of measuring social impact. So what happens is, and oftentimes you see with large scale sporting events, think of the Olympics, right? So the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, does an incredible job now. They've had so much pressure about measuring the environmental impacts. They have a carbon calculator that's like no other. But when it comes to social impacts, they're like, yeah, we look at that, but we're working on it. And so it's constantly like a work in progress. And it's because of that intangibility of these social impacts. And so what I argue, and I think what is an incredible opportunity, I know Zoe is going to touch on this more, is that I think that the travel unity is in a place that, and they're going to be talking about, Roni and Chi will be introducing later, the standards that they're thinking of creating, they're developing in the process of creating now, about looking at each of these aspects of DEI in sports and events. So not just looking at environmental and the criteria around that, but looking at the social and the economic. And so, and how that kind of surfaces together, you know, again, back to that interdependence and interconnectedness. So in case you're wondering, I just want to put this out there as a resource. So some of the tools that I've used, if you're like, yeah, I know there's tools, but really what are they? Some of the ones that I'm familiar with and I've seen used quite often in events. So there's one, Destination International has an economic impact calculator. So what's interesting about this one is that they measure the economic value of the event and then it calculates the ROI in terms of how it impacts local taxes. So that's an interesting tool to use. I mentioned the IOC's carbon footprint one. And then the last one, this is funny. I was doing some research for a class that I was teaching, and there's actually a website now. It's called Event Impacts. And it has all of the tools. So it has calculators for social, economic, and environmental impacts. It was a collaboration between, I think it's Discovered Northern Ireland, the Department of Culture and Media for, I think, Scotland, London partners. So it's a largely UK and Scottish-based initiative, but a lot of the tools are free, and it's great because you can continue to calculate these over time. And I think most of the tools are low cost. So in any event, I just want to emphasize some of the key challenges are the fact that right now there's an abundance of resources, but it's not clear and a standard one to use. And the second being the social impacts, which are the impacts directly related to DEI, are sloppy to measure. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. I believe Nick is up next to talk about the economic impacts. Do I have that right, or is it Zoe? Is it Nick? Yeah? Okay, perfect. So thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Kelly. And you said it, and I actually wrote this down. There are too many different resources. There are too many different ways to calculate economic impact. And that's where it gets hard to really understand how do you trust the numbers, and how do you evaluate, what's true and what's not. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I don't think these numbers are necessarily untrustworthy or anything like that. It's just there's so many different ways. There's no standard way of calculating what economic impact is. And I think in a lot of cases, we want to focus on the dollars being generated. But again, going back to where the dollars are going and how we can improve the sporting event industry as a whole. And I say that because we like to look at things from just the bottom line, that's the economic impact, but we don't really think about the participation. We don't necessarily think about the spectatorship. When we do, it's always going back to economic impact. And I think when you hear these things like sport participation among youth are declining, and you read all these things, in many cases, we just want to throw money at it and just say, it's a funding issue. And I think that's kind of a poor way of looking at it, because you're not really, again, asking the questions and trying to understand, like, what are the issues at hand? And so a lot of times it's a socioeconomic issue. And one organization that does it very well is Indiana Sports Corp and their Geared for Health initiative. They do this initiative to try and get gently used and new sporting equipment to then donate to underprivileged and underserved organizations amongst the Indianapolis and Hoosier community, so that these leagues have an opportunity to engage with communities that may not be able to afford participation in sport. And I think that's where it gets really important to be able to engage with those participants and taking that profit that you're getting from some of these events and taking some of these areas that you may actually have control of and being able to actively spread the wealth, so to speak, amongst the communities. I think a big thing is the legacy impact that these sporting events have. Major sporting events do it very well because they have the resources, whether that's human capital, vendor capital, financial capital, to be able to create these opportunities to impact the communities. But these smaller sporting events, the margins are so thin that it's so hard to be able to leave that impact. There are so many different ways you can engage, and be able to host these sporting events is truly a luxury. But at the same time, there's so much that can go into it by partnering underserved organizations with any league. It can be Little League Baseball, it can be a youth hockey league, whatever it is, because like Zoe mentioned, taking your son to a hockey game like that, you don't know it until you see it and actively participate in it. And so it's being able to provide those opportunities to be able to engage with different communities. So I know that kind of got away from the economic impact side, but economic impact in and of itself is very hard to control. But while the money is being spent, that's where it's easy. And that's where I say it's easy, but unfortunately, it's just not done well yet. I think it's starting, being able to push where that money is being spent and how it's being spent. And while the event is there, doing some of those legacy things that impact youth participation and be able to provide opportunities that otherwise kids and families may not have. So next, I'm gonna roll it over to Zoe and she'll cap it off for us.
Yeah, I don't think you got away from the point at all, because I think what you spoke to is buying power of communities, right? And when we understand that, we talk about economic impact, those things that Kelly said that are, not quantifiable, but still someone's experience at a game will determine where they're going to spend their money, right? And that's why we do marketing, and that's why we create experiences that are memorable so that people come back. So if I have an unpleasant experience, guess what? You don't get my money. And so businesses need to think about that. But, in a sense, to bring it all together for me, what I hear, when we're talking about there isn't a traditional way in which these things are measured, or, we're trying to figure out how to calculate these worth. It goes all back to who's at the table. That's it's representation. And so if at the boardroom, at that conference table, when the planning is happening, if there isn't representation across these different social identities, of course, you're not going to consider the value or worth of a group that's not represented there. So that's why these companies come out with marketing ads or programs or initiatives that have nothing to do with the demographics that they serve, or it only serves one small group. Or historically, this is where we get into the conversation about history, where people want to run from. But if we bring it into sports, when I see a movie about Jackie Robinson, it unpacks a whole history that was going on that's absolutely where people try to dismiss, because we just want to have fun. We just want to do sports. But the reality is you can't skip over that part. You can't skip over the fact that baseball was split and there was the Negro leagues, right? And then now, you know, or when you look at it at the NFL, when you look at the data of the NFL, and over 70% of players are African American, and you have less than 5% being owners or coaches, that throws me off, right? And so I think all of, again, interconnectedness. I love that word, Kelly, as you opened it up, because it is all related. It's very much related when you start having these conversations. How do these experiences, how do sports, how do these leisure activities impact the people that are showing up? How are they going to spend their money? What kind of experience are we designing? Is it accessible? So it goes into everything, you know, and yeah, there's so many different directions that we can go. And I think to make it a lot less overwhelming, I use one thing that I help companies really to assess, you know, where they're going to take this. And it's to look at several of those areas. Again, going back to leadership, buy-in, commitment, representation is commitment. There's 5 C's, right? The commitment. There's the capacity. What kind of time, money are you investing into making changes that are sustainable and measurable? You know, what is the climate of your organization? If you're going to, you know, commit to making change, what is it, your policies and procedures look like? What does the culture of your organization look like, so that you can, you know, take whether it's a small local team or a large association like NFL, NBA, to a different direction that is more inclusive, right? And then we look at characteristics, again, those demographics that are represented. But when you have these frameworks, that there are so many out there, you have to look at the metrics that matter. And that goes back to, you know, the worth and value that you talked about, you know, Nick, is that, again, what we deem is valuable, or what we believe that is, you know, worth looking at, depends on who's represented. You know, the conversations change, the narrative changes when you have representation across, you know, multiple groups, so that there's different, you know, thought processes coming in. And that's how innovation, and we get to different outcomes. So yeah, definitely, it always starts with assessments. If you don't know where to go, assess, making sure that you are focused on the metrics that matter.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, everybody. I've got one more question for everybody before we start talking about the standard stuff that TU has been and is going to keep working on, which is, I know we've heard a few examples already, but other than what you've already mentioned, who in the events and sports space should people be looking to as examples, not necessarily doing everything perfectly, but in a specific way that you could think of? Anybody have one? Kelly.
I can go. So when you first put that in the chat, I kind of froze and I was like, oh, that's hard, right? Like it's hard to find a good example. Like at first my mind went to, I'm like, farmers markets are good. And then I'm like, no, they're not. Like it depends what area you're in. I think, you know, the farmers market that I'd been going into in Brooklyn was like, I felt like was very inclusive and representative, but that by far is not a good example. So my mind went to, I had done some research in South Africa about social impacts of tourism. And there's an organization there called VinPro. And I would say they blew me out of the water, because it twisted my brain about how I thought about like looking at events and inclusivity in wine production, and how people had access to wine. And so VinPro was really interesting. So they organize a series of events. They do a bunch of fundraisers to empower local community members, particularly of, you know, the Black community in South Africa. And they use the term coloreds for mixed races in South Africa. So they look specifically to empower them, to get them into ownership positions, not just working in the field. So VinPro has a series of events and fundraising initiatives that are structured around that. And I was really impressed with the way that they made sure. So for instance, I went to this one wine tasting event, and they made sure each individual, for every like white vendor that they had there, they needed to ensure that there was Black and or a colored vendor that was accurately represented. And so, and not just speaking on behalf, again, like they looked at the growers, they looked at the sommeliers, they looked at every aspect. And so I think VinPro would be a great example. And I think the other aspect that VinPro I was really impressed with, it wasn't just like the events that they organized that were inclusive, but it was also, they really paid attention to how DEI flowed through every aspect of wine production in that region. And so they looked at, for instance, a lot of the wine workers in the fields were not showing up for work at times. They were late, and there was, it was just, it was becoming an issue. It was affecting production, and, it was becoming an issue. So instead of saying like reprimanding them, they went to the root of it. So, and they looked at the problems that were associated with, why are you late? Like, how can we help support that? And so now they host events to educate others of how they can best support these workers and provide resources for them, instead of just saying, you're late for work, you're fired. But more importantly, your child was sick and you had no place to take them, and you didn't have a car to take them to the hospital, so you had to stay home with them. And that's why you were late for work. And so they take it to another level. Again, not just in the event planning aspect, but looking at the representation, as Zoe had said very clearly and importantly throughout, but also peeling back the layers of what was happening in this space. And so I think that's a really important piece, not just looking at the surface level of what you think about, why something isn't happening, or why this, is going on, but understanding the whole system that's associated with that. So I would say VinPro is a good example, and they're, I would say a leader in DEI.
So that's great, Kelly. I had not heard of them, and I just pulled them up. And I think part of what you could see if you start looking into it is that it's not happenstance that they're doing this. It's part of the foundation of how they see themselves. And as we continue working with associations in the travel space, I don't know if any of them, honestly, and we're working with them, we respect them, we know there's work to do, but I don't know that any of them have this term socioeconomic issues as a core of their focus. So that's
Can I add something quick to that, Roni? So, but what's interesting, and I think Zoe will also, she made this is interesting. So from a socioeconomic perspective, think of South Africa. They were forced into this position because of the disgusting history of what they had to deal with apartheid for so long. So it took them years to develop stuff like this, but now this is part of their everyday dialogue. Not every single person, but VinPro, there's a lot of agencies like VinPro and organizations like VinPro, because they're actively addressing these deep socioeconomic issues in ways that I don't think we're doing as well in the US. And so I was very impressed and inspired when I came back about how not only VinPro, but other organizations are speaking openly about these issues and integrating it into events that they're hosting and being mindful up front. Zoe has said in the beginning, as we were planning for this, the importance of starting from the first point when you're thinking about this event. How can I integrate DEI? Not waiting until after, but thinking about it up front. So I'll leave it at that. So I'm interested to hear the others' thoughts.
Yeah, I would, again, that I'm going to keep saying interconnectedness, because when my brain just wrote this little chart, as you were talking about VinPro, socioeconomic status, and us understanding, what does that really mean? Understanding someone's social identity and what their economic status has to do with, how they engage, how they're able to show up, whether that be how they're employed, how they're housed, how they eat, really looking at those aspects. And I think it really goes back to how these different organizations, and why we may not find an example, because what we're looking for is for people to not be performative in their efforts, but to be sustainable. So when we look at the definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I see a lot of fluff, honestly, right? And that's because I think there's a gap in our discourse. We're trying to find the ways, how do we define these in a way that we're going to move the needle? And so diversity is probably the easiest one to define, representation across all social identities, right? And understanding that, federally and state-wise, there are about 8 to 9 that are protected, right? But then there's about 23 plus and growing identities. So diversity is a little easier to define. When we talk about equity, which took place or replaced equality, that's a conversation in and of itself. Why did we switch from equality to equity, right? And people hear equity, they think financial, that economic. And then when we talk about inclusion, this is the one that's always tricky. Every time people define inclusion, it's still where they position the group that's historically been in power as the gatekeepers, as the ability to let the out group in. Whereas when I define inclusion, I want it to be understood that it is the distribution and the balance of power across all those social identities. So it doesn't get to say that I get to tell you whether or not you get to come in. I get to say, is it inclusive in the way does everyone have access to power? And while some people may try to co-opt that and say, oh, that's socialism and this, that, and the third, again, that's a whole nother conversation. But it really goes into a company like Venpro, who's looking at the economic sustainability of groups, because historically, people have not been able, those who have been marginalized, have not been able to build generational wealth. And when you don't have wealth, you don't have real estate. You can't start a business. You can't feed your family. So it touches on all those areas. You can't going to a sporting event, like leisure wise, like if you look at the history of leisure, you have whole groups, communities that were cut off from leisure because they were in service to the dominant group. They didn't have the residual income to go watch horseback riding, to go watch baseball. They were the servants. And so having to understand history of it, understand that if you truly are committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, it's looking at systems and institutions and righting the wrong so that there's access to economic opportunities, period, point blank. And so all the fluffiness about we're going to sit around and sing songs with each other, that's cute and it's performative. It's not sustainable. But when you start talking about how can I position someone in order to make money, to feed their family, to build generational wealth, now we're talking. Come talk to me. Now we can have a real conversation. So sorry, I got in my mode. Yeah, get in the zone, but you and Kelly's over there laughing, but it's all about that economic empowerment, period, point blank. I'll leave it there.
Those are both great answers, and I don't even know how I can follow that up. But so with my background being in sport administration, it's where I did my bachelor's, my master's in sport administration. Sports has been my life, and so I have a very generic answer, Roni, but I think it's very stimulating. But I think when you look at the big five sports leagues, the NFL, the NHL, NBA, MLS, MLB, and the NCAA in its respective institutions, I think they're all in some way, shape, or form doing it well because they're willing to create avenues to where they're being informative. And I think that's really what's key, because the viewership is so large. You have tens of millions of people watching all these respective events, and especially the mega events like the Super Bowl and the World Series, which is going on right now. They have legacy programs tied to these events that give back to the community, promote the community, and overall have a very positive impact. And so when I think you look at these very, very large organizations in these very large leagues, I think when you're willing to promote various areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think you're spurring the thought amongst people that may otherwise not think about it. And I know, like what we had mentioned earlier, and I want to make sure the lack of interest in DEI, they are in a way making DEI an interest, and they're creating an opportunity for people to at least look into it and be more informative. And I think that's who is doing it well because of the vastness of audience that they have and the resources that they have to be able to give back to those underserved communities and those minority-owned businesses and the underrepresented.
Thanks, Nick. Chi, I think you had something.
Yeah, so this isn't necessarily sports and event related, although it could be. And this is also going back to Zoe's comment about, who's at the table. There's an organization called Planet Happiness, which does a destination measurement of happiness and well-being. It looks at community, environment, learning, psychological well-being. I have it in front of me, so I'm reading it. Government, health, standard of living, social support, time balance, and then satisfaction with life, work, and then tourism. And so across these 11 domains, the idea is to measure residents' well-being and how they perceive all of these things. And in a longitudinal study, you could look at, you could have these interventions to say, okay, this is what, seems to be lacking in this community, and we can develop policy to change that. And then over time, you move the needle. This is a project in progress. So it is more of a theoretical approach, but I believe in it. And I think that instituting not that we need more measurements clearly, but this is more of the social the social side, that that it could be something that that would be good in this space. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Thanks for the
Thank you,
link,
P.
Ronnie.
Yeah. So we are going to wrap up this panel part and talk about the standards work that Travel Unity is doing. Any other final thoughts from our panel, from our attendees? Now's your time. If you got Zoe, you got it.
Just real quick, I want to kind of slightly correct myself, because we always talk about, because this is all good information about, measurements and looking at economic impact and looking at, who's doing it right. I don't want to dismiss some of, even though we don't like saying it, performative gestures, because the things that people are doing, I think, Kelly, you alluded to it earlier, the small steps that people are taking, it is nice to be seen. It is nice for somebody to recognize that, to sing Lift Every Voice and sing, is also needed. Or to see different groups, like when I watch Netflix and I see an Asian couple married, and I get to be exposed to different music from different groups, or get to hear about transgender. It's nice to have these different ways that you can engage and listen to different music and with different people's culture and ethnicity and history. So I don't want to dismiss some of those performances that are going on. What I'm saying is just don't stop there, and that can't be the end part. Okay, we did that, and not talk about the economic aspect. So both in combination with all of what we're saying, start somewhere. I guess I'll go back to that, but make sure you don't end there.
Yeah, and I thanks so much for adding that, Zoe. And I think just to wrap up, like I've learned so much, by the way, through the conversation today from Nick, Zoe, and Roni. So I'm super grateful for this. And I think what we continue to do is to learn in this space. And like you just said, Zoe, to take small steps. I do have to say, I'm incredibly inspired right now, like about the progress that's being made. Like just looking over this over the last 15 years, the steps that we've taken in the last 5, I think are pretty significant. So even though it feels overwhelming in terms of the amount of resources that are out there, I think the fact that Travel Unity and other organizations in this space are starting to have these conversations, like we're heading in that direction. So I see this as an incredible opportunity to continue this, right? So for DEI in sports and events and beyond that, right? So like my work is largely in tourism specifically, but I think we have a really great opportunity, and I think that's actually good transition, after Nick talks to introduce these standards. So thank you again for joining us today. So, and thanks for teaching me, you guys, Nick and Zoe and Chi and Roni. So I'll turn it over to you, Nick.
Yeah, and I want to echo what Kelly said, because I think we've seen a lot of it in the last few years, is the amount of organizations and the amount of people that are talking about DEI and trying to understand what it is. And I mean, and I'm fairly new to Travel Unity, I'm still trying to understand. And so I think being able to be willing to be mindful of what's going on around you and what's going on in the world in general, and being willing to ask the hard questions. A mentor of mine, we talked about this almost 2 years ago, and it's all about just being willing to ask the tough questions and being willing to understand that's how you begin to make an impact. And I think there are a lot of organizations right now that are implementing new strategies and new ways to promote DEI and to enact it. And I think hopefully we'll continue to see that grow, and we'll continually see people being mindful and being willing to ask the hard questions and then being willing to act on those actions. Thank you all. Appreciate it very much, and great conversation.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Chi. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, everybody who watched this.